Hello and welcome to the Rogue Monkey podcast. We're the show that shares stories and insights from different people all around the world, and our hope is to give inspiration to you to challenge yourself as we explore some fascinating journeys from sport through to business, from the arts through to extreme adventurers, with previous guests including the captain of the Red Arrows, Netflix producers and Olympic champions. This week, in the second of a two-part special, we speak to our extreme decisions specialist, Brad Borkan. For those of you that haven't listened yet to episode 57, make sure you head back and check that out for part 1. In this week's conversation, we explore Brad's second book, titled When Your Life Depends on It, Extreme Decision-Making Lessons from Antarctica. Some of the areas we explore are unfathomable, even in the current day, let alone over 100 years ago when some of the stories shared were set. With many of us, we will come nowhere near many of the challenges that these explorers faced. Their philosophies, morals and lessons learned, though, is something that we can draw upon in the modern day. Just before we get into our conversation, please make sure you give us a follow on our social pages, as we're sharing so much new exciting content, whether that's motivational quotes, shorts and inspiring messages, and other notes from previous guests. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn. Just search for the Rogue Monkey podcast. So here we go with this week's conversation, which we've no doubt you'll take a lot away from. Episode 58, Brad Borkan Part 2. When Your Life Depends on It, Extreme Decision-Making Lessons from the Antarctic. Hello, Brad. Welcome back for our second episode. How are you doing?
Very well, Kevin. It's great to be here again.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to exploring the next book on our journey. So I've obviously read both your books, but today we're going to be talking a little bit about When Your Life Depends on It. But just for our listeners who are joining us for the first time, if you can just give us a quick introduction as to who you are before we dive into the literacy world that you've been working in.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Brad Borkan, and I'm an author and historian. And prior to becoming an author and historian, I was working full-time for high-tech companies like Oracle and SAP. And in the process of that, started getting very interested in decision-making and Antarctica and various things. And that sort of led to the books that we've been discussing. One of the books we're going to discuss today and the book we discussed last week.
Fantastic. Well, the book itself is obviously centers around decision-making, as you've already mentioned. And where did this kind of fascination with decision-making come from? Because this isn't just decision-making in what I would say day-to-day life. This is very extreme decision-making. So where did that fascination with that kind of aspect of what you've done so far come from?
Well, it comes from two areas. One is I'm very interested in advertising and why do people do what they do? Why do we respond to certain types of ads or certain things that we see, and how do people look at decisions and make decisions and respond to decisions? And I've always had another interest, which is Antarctica and the early explorers and the decisions that they made. And it was combining those interests that led to this journey. And we'll talk more about the book, but it's this very keen interest in why do we do what we do? And what can we learn from people who made decisions many years ago that we can bring into our modern lives?
So painting a picture, I guess, to give everyone some context, because, you know, we all make decisions every single day, some big, some small, some for us, some for others. But the environment and the context of which both your research and your book is based in, can you just give you've been there, so can you give our listeners and viewers some context as to the environment and also the time in which this took place? Because the research you've done is, although it's applicable now, these were people that were making decisions in a very different world to the one we currently live in.
Right. And that's what was so interesting, was if you want to study people who are making decisions, we can study modern people, but you have so many variables that affect our decision making. Whereas if you put people into Antarctica in the early 1900s, the early explorers, their decisions were made in isolation. They didn't have any communication methods. They couldn't even communicate to each other other than through shouting, fundamentally. And it's hard to shout in the Antarctic wind. So in that respect, it was very pure decision making. They couldn't rely on other people. There was no one who had been there where they were, and they really had to rely on their own wits and just be very self-reliant. So there's a lot of takeaways and looking at them specifically. And you're asking about the time frame. The time frame is the early 1900s. So that's everything from the first person to set foot on Antarctica was 1895. And the first expeditions we look at started in 1901. So it's very early on. They weren't even sure it was a continent. No one had really traveled inland at all. So there was a really pioneering pioneering not only what it was like to be there, but how to be there, how to live and survive in an environment where there literally is nothing. There's no wood to build with, there's no wood to burn for fire. There's seals and penguins and some birds, but only on the coastline. And they really had to figure out what they needed, how to survive, how to do science and discovery and exploration, and all in the hope of getting to the South Pole ultimately.
There was, I've read the book, and there's stories at both ends, I guess, of the spectrum in terms of wonderful inspiration and positivity versus, quite literally buried in the depths of hell, it felt like, for some of the experiences that they had. And was talking to a mutual friend of ours not too long ago, and they went to Antarctica last year, and was talking about how when they got to the shore, the closest people to them were in the ISS, and trying to get your head around, even in the modern day thinking, I can't imagine sitting, in leafy Hertfordshire, looking up to the sky going, the people in space are closer to me than anyone in a loop around me right now. And that, again, go back 100+ years, is almost unfathomable in terms of not just the fact that they did it, but the success stories that came with it, because it wasn't just we turned up kind of thing. They got to the very remote environment, but then had to put themselves into extremely hostile conditions that, I guess, changed so much through a year. And like learning through a book about the nature of Antarctica and the seasons, if we can call it that. Obviously there are seasons there, but very different to the seasons that we're used to. And then again, trying to implement this day-to-day normal thinking of, how do you get up? How do you have food? How do you go to the bathroom? All of those sorts of things. Those kind of decisions in an environment like that are so different to perhaps what we're used to.
Yes, absolutely. And we talk about going to the bathroom. You go to the bathroom very quickly. But that's right. They were very isolated from other people, and whether your security back to other people would be, probably the closest land that's inhabited is really New Zealand. And it depends on which part of Antarctica you're on, but it's thousands and thousands of sea miles, nautical miles across some of the roughest waters in the world. And so whether you're going back to New Zealand or to the southern tip of Argentina and Chile, the bottom of South America, there were whaler stations in South Georgia, which is an island. But fundamentally, they were very, very isolated. And even today, when you're in Antarctica, you're very isolated. When this trip that I was on, we didn't see other people, didn't see other ships. So you really had a sense that, of the enormity of the environment. And there are seasons. I mean, so just to set that in context, you have, as they say in Maine in the USA, you've got like winter, July, and August. Well, because Maine's so cold, but in Antarctica, you have distinct seasons in the sense that you've got winter, which is most of the year, but only half the year the sun's doesn't rise above the horizon as you go further south and get closer to the South Pole. In that non-season, it starts warming up very slightly, and then because it's at the bottom of the world, seasons are reversed. So their springtime is sort of November, and then summer is sort of December, January, and ends February, and then you're back into the height of winter again. But at least you have sunshine going down to until it gets into later in the year.
To give some context, what sort of temperatures in the height of summer are we talking about in a place like Antarctica?
Well, when I was there, I would say the height, I was there sort of in the springtime at end of November. The coldest day you experienced in London was a warm day there. So in a way, it's like, it was pretty seriously cold, but we were also very quite bundled up for it. So you don't quite feel it as much because you do have the right clothing for it. And then, but if the sun's shining, if you have a very bright sunny day, it's probably not unlike skiing in the Alps, where bright sunshine reflects off the snow. It can actually feel fairly warming, especially if you're bundled up and you find yourself unzipping your jacket and whatever to cool down a bit from the bright sunshine. But the difference there is that the weather can change dramatically very quickly. And so you can go from a minute where the sun's shining, it's very warm, or feels warm. Next minute, the wind picks up, the clouds over, and you're literally feeling very, very cold. And that's when I was there in November. When you're going into the height of winter, you're talking the explorers, the early explorers experienced temperatures of minus, I think the worst they had was minus 77 that they recorded. So it's pretty serious temperatures.
With technology that was 100 plus years old, I mean, even now we go outside on days when it's drops into the minuses full stop, but let's say -5 with an easterly wind here, your phone doesn't like it. The battery starts going a bit quicker. We get a runny nose, we get red cheeks, and we shuffle from place to place quite quickly. Whereas out there 100 plus years ago, with very limited navigation, zero support other than your own team, it's so alien to try and get your head around that concept of not just being isolated, but being isolated in a place where every decision that we make during the day that here we take for granted, out there can become a life or death decision, whether that's when am I cooking food, when am I stopping, when am I sitting down, when am I standing up, am I moving away from the group, am I not, where I'm stepping, left foot, right foot. All of those decisions in that environment are so dangerous even now, and back then they were still proving successful, it's mind-blowing when you really dig into it. And that's what I really enjoyed about the book, because it jumped off the page of how unfathomable really that these journeys that these people went on were. And obviously there were some real tragedies that occurred, but there was also some incredible stories of success, which makes it even more ridiculous when you look at the context of the environment they were in back then.
Yes, even a trip to the latrine, and there was this case where they had the main hut and the latrine was built somewhat away from the main hut. A trip to the latrine could turn deadly, and that was and there was a case where a person had gone to the latrine and actually got turned around, and with the lizards trying to form, couldn't figure out which way they were, and then they started saying, okay, what we need to do is set a series of ropes to poles, and so that we can actually, if you can't see where you're going, at least you can follow the rope back to the main hut. So it's a serious environment. The other thing that is you can't really see in the photograph behind me as much, but there are crevasses that are hidden by snow, and what's called a snow lid, which is basically an ice formation that's snowed over. So it looks like solid ground. It looks like solid snow. And you can be walking along and all of a sudden you step onto a snow lid and the ice gives way and you fall. Now, as you can see in the photograph that's associated with my book, that they're pulling sledges and they're attached to the sled by harnesses. So if they fall into a crevasse, for the most part, not in every case, but in many cases, the sledge didn't go behind, didn't fall in with them. It was usually stuck at the surface, and they're dangling down by the harness. And their teammates have to pull them out, or if they're on their own, they have to climb up the harness rope. But there were cases as well where someone fell in and the sledge fell in right behind them, and they were killed, and all the supplies were lost. And those sorts of situations are catastrophic because you can't recover your supplies, and your supplies may be tents, sleeping bags, extra clothing, food, fuel for heating, the snow to turn into water. So just and another thing for people to understand is that you can't eat the snow. So yes, you can put the snow in your mouth, but actually doing that only generates a very small amount of water and can lower your core body temperature. which can be fatal. So everything you're doing, including making tea, you've got to heat snow to have drinking water. You've got to heat snow to make tea. You've got, it's a very challenging environment for them.
So, and distilling, I guess, the overwhelmingness of that environment and all the different stories that you spoke about in the book, you came down to a point, again, looping back to where we started around decision making, where actually there were some key learnings that you took away from that. So just going to try and explore a few of those right now, if you're happy with it. But I think some of the things that jumped out for me on its own was actually, it was incredible that looking back on people in such a quite literally alien environment over 100 years ago, with completely different time, technology, society, and everything else compared to nowadays. And there are still some very core things that actually we can take back. And looking at the list of the 7 things you talked about, there was very obviously some really transferable lessons into modern day life. And then, of course, you think, well, of course there is, because everyone has decisions they have to make, perhaps not to the same extreme, perhaps in some cases to the same extreme. But it was very interesting to see, reading this book of just overwhelming stories, both positive and negative, and then suddenly going, right, this is what we've taken from it. And I really liked that. So yeah, should we start exploring some of those learnings?
Sure. Yeah, perfectly.
So the first one you talked about was meeting every decision head on. And that for me is something that, especially when I'm working with, I guess, students and people kind of coming out of the back end, if you like, of the education system right now, is saying, right, forget life being easy, forget the workplace being easy. You're going to have lots of challenges and obstacles to overcome, and you can either avoid them or you can either take them head on. And immediately that was the first one that I went, well, I can relate to that immediately. So how did that sit with you?
Exactly. Every time that the explorers had to make a decision, the early explorers, they made a decision. They didn't procrastinate. Well, partly because it's so cold, you don't have time to procrastinate. And sometimes someone falls into a crevasse. If your teammate falls into a crevasse, you don't have time to go, do we do this or do we do that? You've got to take action immediately. But there are other times when they could prevaricate or overthink things, and they didn't. They basically just said, this is the decision we've got to make, and we're going to make the choice now. And I think with our modern technology and modern tools, with the internet, we can overthink things to a very great degree. We can analyze, and maybe never make a decision, or end up not making even a better decision than we would have if we just made a quick decision. But what they were good at is dealing with bad decisions. And I think that's going to bring us up to point number 2, isn't it?
Yeah, so making the best of a bad decision. And just jumping on that first point as well, I remember listening to an interview with a Formula One mechanic a few years ago, and them saying, by the time you've got to a corner, if you thought about going around the corner, you've already crashed because you're going so fast. And the best Formula One drivers are the ones who have that ability to just instinctively make decisions. And I find that interesting lineage between high performance people in a lot of different extreme sports where it really is life and death situations, and their ability to just make a decision. So I really like that first point. But yeah, it does lead nicely, because all decisions aren't perfect, and ultimately you will have some bad decisions that are made in an imperfect environment. So making the best of them.
And yeah, so in looking at bad decisions, what they were very good at, and they made a lot of bad decisions, was trying to make the best. They knew they had enough resilience and smarts and to some degree experience, but also just the ability to learn on the fly, and that they could recover from a bad decision, or at least try to recover from a bad decision. They're also very good at compartmentalizing. So not blaming each other for the bad decision, not blaming the leader, not blaming other teammates, just being, okay, we are where we are. We're in this crevasse field on the Beardmore Glacier. The Beardmore Glacier, that's not the Beardmore Glacier. That's just the coastline of Antarctica, which is a photo I took. But the Beardmore Glacier is going to look something sort of like that. It's this enormous glacier that they would have to have climbed up, pulling sledges like you see in the photograph. And in this case, they could easily end up in a crevasse field. And at that stage, you can blame each other for, like, why didn't you navigate us out of this? Why didn't you, why are we in this mess, basically? On the other hand, it's just like, we're in it. We now have to move forward out of it somehow. And yes, we're going to have to cross some very scary snow lids and risk falling in crevasses and all these other things that they're going to have to get through. But it was not focusing on blame, but just focusing on here's where we are today, which is just a fantastic lesson for COVID and the world we live. We live in a world that's starting in March 2020. We moved into a world that was filled with risk and danger, and it is easy to look back and go, I wish it wasn't this way. It's easy to look back at 2019 and go, wow, that was when life was easy and I could just go out and didn't have to take lateral flow tests and get on an airplane and not have to worry about COVID testing or will the person I'm sitting next to have COVID or whatever. And now we live in a world that that's the way it is. We live here in this chaotic, challenging, risky world, no different than them being in a crevasse field. And it's just, that's what it is. We got to just accept it and move forward with it.
It links nicely into the next point, because you mentioned there around teammates and leaders and all those sorts of things. And ultimately, the vast majority of people out there in some capacity function within a team, even if the team is actually their home family unit versus their professional work team, for example. So engaging with people within their team is something that these explorers seem to do very well.
Yes, everything they did was with teams, and I thought that was really remarkable, and it sort of like really struck us when we were writing the book. My co-author is based in California and I'm based in London. And we thought of ourselves as a little team who were trying to craft this book. But one of the things that struck us was that everything that was done, even the scientific experiments, were really ever done by an individual. They were always done with multiple people. And partly from a safety point of view, but partly from there was value in having the teamwork and value in having a leader. And what was interesting that we discovered and we talk about in the book is the concept of a leader and a second in command. Even in a small team, you may have 3 people in a team, but having a leader and a second in command on that. Now, sometimes it was a stated second in command, sometimes it was not stated, but people knew, okay, this guy's a second in command just by their stature, by their knowledge, by their experience. And they got themselves into a lot of serious scrapes. I mean, basically, the book opens with a scene of 3 men out on the ice. They've been out there for 750 miles, going out towards the South Pole, but not getting to the South Pole, and they're on their way back. And one of the men is dying of scurvy. And they get to the stage where he says, leave me behind to die, basically. Leave me behind, you guys save yourselves, we're running out of food. The conditions aren't favorable for travel. And if you keep waiting for me, I'm getting slower and slower, and you're having to actually pull me on the sledge. So 2 men pulling a sledge actually designed for 4 people. That they're with this guy's weight on top of it. It's what do you do in that situation? And he was their leader in that little 3-man team. He was their leader and giving you this order. So it's these circumstances are challenging, morally difficult, very difficult for people to make these sorts of decisions, and yet they did. And the story of what happened next, I don't want to spoil it for people who read the book, is just the most remarkable story of what happens when what they decide to do and what the 2 men achieve. And it's just one of the most stunningly unforgettable stories in exploration history.
So we talk about inspiration and how it comes from, I guess, different places. And I think there's something that I've seen, I guess, working in the sports world with athletes is like you'll see them hit a wall of, they talk about it in the marathon, you hit the wall and then you have to look somewhere and find something to inspire you and lift you up. And it often comes from places that you probably never even knew existed, perhaps weren't even looking for. And that was something that these explorers seem to have in abundance, that ability to go somewhere and find something to get them through often some very, horrible situations.
Yes, there's a wonderful story about Mawson. I mean, it's not wonderful, but it's one of the most remarkable stories, which is this guy, Douglas Mawson, who's Australian. He's on an expedition that he's leading, and he and 2 men are trying to get to the South Magnetic Pole. Now, the magnetic pole is different from the South Pole. The magnetic pole is where all the compass points, if you look at it, your compass and it's pointing south. It's pointing to the South Magnetic Pole, not to the South Pole. And they're trying to get to the South Magnetic Pole. And on the journey out, he's with two other men. They've got two sledges. One has the more valuable supplies on it, the tent, and most of the food and other things. They have dogs. They and as I said, the danger of crevasses. One of what they do to avoid crevasses, and they have the sledge that has less important materials on it is being led by, they have dogs being led by one man, and the other man, the third man's walking ahead trying to see where the crevasse dangers are, and the one with the sledge with the most important supplies is behind. So the idea is that they spot where the danger is, and the guy behind with the most important sledge and the best dogs will not fall into anything that they spot. Well, it just happened that he did. The guy behind with the sledge fell into a crevasse with the dogs, the best dogs, and the best equipment, and he dies. They lose all the equipment, and so now there are two men left, Mawson and another colleague, and they're literally have very little food left, no tent, sleeping under a tarp. Basically, they do have sleeping bags, and in the end, the other man, because they're eating dogs as they die off, they start consuming dog liver, which contains very high amounts of vitamin A, and which is poisonous to human beings, and in those quantities. And so his colleague starts dying and does ultimately die. So now Moss is on his own. He's been weakened. He has the same vitamin A poisoning. He's weakening, and he's on his own, and he's hundreds of miles away from safety, and no one's going to come rescue him. And he falls in a crevasse, and it brings us to the incredible story where the sledge doesn't fall in, but he falls in, and he's held by that harness about 14 feet down, and he tries to climb out, and he's wearing, I mean, you think back to the clothing that people wore in the 1900s, heavy coats, heavy boots. They didn't have all this insulate that we have nowadays. And so he's wearing very heavy clothing that's very ice encrusted. And so he's pulling himself up and gets to the top of this crevasse, and the snow breaks away, and he falls back down. And he's just totally at the end of his ability. I mean, he's really like, now, might as well just give up. And he thinks of a poem, and he gets inspiration from a poem. And it's this sense that we can find inspiration, whether it's in music, whether it's in poetry, whether it's in thinking of friends or thinking of family, or whatever it is that we drive inspiration from, just like marathon runners, exactly that you're gathering inspiration from somewhere deep inside of you that enables you. And he did eventually climb out. He did ultimately get rescued. He did ultimately climb out, did get back to base camp, and but the story is actually more incredible than that. Just to give you a slight taste of the sorts of stories that are in the book. He gets back to base camp, but the ship, he can see in the harbor that the ship has already left, because the ships can't stay near the shore because of the ice formations and because they can get iced in. So he knows, the time that the ship is going to leave for that season, it'll come back when winter ends. So he's at the tail end of the tail end of summer. He sees the ship going, and he can't get it back. He's stuck there for another whole winter season. Fortunately, a few men stayed behind and overwintered with him. But it's like this incredible story, and he misses the ship by 5 hours, and it's those sorts of things, and he still survives. And it's
that mentality of, and again, very not in any way drawing a straight comparison, because they are completely different, but that it links into, I guess, that next takeaway decision-making attribute of never giving up and always being able to find a way. And I think you see that in sport and in other aspects of life and human history before, where the odds are infinitely stacked against somebody, and they've actually made that cognitive decision to say, no, not stopping. Like, I'm not letting this beat me. And you see it occasionally in you know, these medical triumphs where they say, oh, they've got a 1% or a 2% chance of survival, and they go, that's enough for me. And you think, yeah, really? And they refuse to give up. And that's something that, again, the explorers of that time seem to absolutely embody, that mentality that it didn't matter what they had to do, they would find a way to make it work.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And there are many, many stories like that. And it's all very inspirational, because even though I was just recounting a story where two men died, the reality was very few of them died when you consider the dangers that they were in. And these were multi-year expeditions. These were not like, we're going down for 1 year. They're going down for 2, 3, 4 years at a time. And they didn't know the ship could get iced in, the ship could get crushed in the ice. There are all these some fantastic stories of them dropping some men off, and it was all men at that period of time doing the exploring. They dropped 6 men off on one shoreline and say, we'll come back for you in 6 weeks, and you're going to explore this area and map it, and we'll come back and pick you up. And they weren't able to pick them up. And the people had to overwinter, and they didn't have enough supplies, and they lived in an ice cave and killed seals and penguins for food and barely survived. I mean, it was the most, harrowing, incredible stories, but they did survive. And I think this is one of the most remarkable things, that these people are almost like indestructible. They just had a mindset that's like, I'm just going to keep going, never give up.
There's one more point I guess I want to explore before I get onto my kind of closing questions, and that is around, I guess, and I say failure in a very respectful sense, because ultimately some of the expeditions that were trying to achieve a certain thing, whether that was achieving to a certain point or doing some scientific research, ultimately failed. And some of the stories of how humans behaved in those moments, especially being documented through diaries that have since been collected and things like that, exploring that a little bit is something that, again, I felt reading the book, it was extremely well done. It was very sensitive to the fact that ultimately many of these people did pass away, although relative to, you say, the amount of people that were trying to do it and the time in which they were living, actually it was a relatively small number of people. But those that did lose their lives did so in very incredible and quite humbling ways.
Yes, yeah, and I think this is one of the remarkable things when you look at Captain Scott and his party. That they were second to the South Pole. They were doing this big scientific. He had Captain Scott had set up this large scientific expedition, and he was aiming to get to the South Pole as part of this. But it wasn't the pure. They were interested in geology and mineralogy and wildlife and snow conditions and weather conditions and currents and all sorts of different things they were studying. And in amongst that, yes, we're going to try to get to the South Pole as well. But there wasn't as much scientific value in being at the South Pole, but it was a milestone that would help fund the rest of the expedition. And in that case, Roald Amundsen had set out to get there first as well, who's Norwegian. And he was originally heading for the North Pole, but then decided he would head for the South Pole after Cook and Parry, who were both American, who had each in different expeditions claimed they got to the North Pole. So he's like, well, if I can't go to the North Pole, I'll go to the South Pole and challenge Scott to get to the South Pole. And Amundsen gets there first, and Scott and his party died on the way back. And it's how they die and what they're doing and what they bring back for science and posterity is just remarkable. And so it's a bit of at one level, it's sad and poignant and touching, and another level, it is just some of the most incredible stories of human nature and what they did to survive as long as they did, and in amongst that, I'll get a little taster for people. I won't give away the story, but they discover some rocks and fossils, and they, even in the last journeys where they could have just jettisoned everything and said, we just got to make the sledge as light as possible, they never jettisoned about 32 pounds in weight of rocks and fossils, and those are very meaningful. And I'll leave you the reading the book about those in we don't go into great detail, but enough to reveal what these represent. And it is quite remarkable that they had the presence of mind to say, yes, we are very likely going to die, but we're not going to give up what we're here for, which is the science. And this is part of that proof. So it's interesting. It's an interesting, touching story.
It really is, and it's such a raw story, because ultimately most of your inspirational stories don't delve to that extreme. It's people that are fighting through adversity in their sport or professional careers, but ultimately it's not life and death decisions, although some of them are. And these both books we've discussed are very much full of those. What would you? Okay, let's invent a time machine. That's going to be my next entrepreneur mission. And you're going to go back and you're going to have a conversation with them in, let's say they all survived, and in 1915 they had a huge convention, and you got to ask them one question. What would be the one thing that you would go back and ask that collective group of people from that period in time?
Wow, that's a serious question. I think ultimately, why would you risk life and limb to go to a spot on Earth? And yes, it is the South Pole, but it's going to look no different than any other spot for hundreds of miles. It's not like going to the top of Everest, where I can understand the appeal of a mountain, getting to the top of a mountain to say, there it is, I'm going to go look at that mountain. I want to be at the top of that mountain. But to be in some snow plane and be like, I want to be at that point, but there's no other than a geophysical point on the planet, there's nothing else there other than to be able to say that when I'm on this point, the rest of the world is revolving above me in a sense. So that is, and that may be enough, and maybe it is just enough for them, but it's to understand why they would do this. And I think thinking back in history as well. So the first expedition, as I said, Scott had his first expedition was in 1901. By 1903, the airplane's invented. And so you'd be thinking, well, at the rate that technology changes, sooner or later you'll be able to fly there. So here we are trudging along, doing what we're doing on the cover of the book, what's called man-hauling. But hey, if we wait 10 years, 15 years, maybe airplane technology will advance to the point where we can fly there. But they weren't waiting. It was like, now I'm going to go, and this is for king and country and ego and glory and being in the record books and a whole bunch of things that drove them.
An open question then that perhaps will never get answered. But then a question then for you around your learnings from it, because you've delved into this area, you're involved in a number of fascinating different polar activities and institutes. So what out of the decision making that you've learned from this period of time where people really did make some incredible decisions have you taken away and then actually applied to your own life?
Yes. So that's quite an interesting story, because there is a story it's one of the other stories that comes out of the polar age, this what's called the heroic age of polar exploration, which is this early 1900s, from about 1901 till about 1914, 1917. And they, this wonderful story of Shackleton and three men are trying to get to the South Pole, and they get to within 103 miles of the South Pole, and they realize they're going to run out of food on the way back. So the question is, what do you do? You've got your goal in front of you. You've gone out 700 miles from the coastline. It's taking you 2 years to get your expedition together. It's taking you 2 or 3 months to get to the stage where you are right now. You know you're going to have a tough journey on the way back. You're running out of food. Do you go forward to your goal, or do you turn around and start heading back towards safety? And it's a really, really tough decision. It's something that listeners could think about what they would do, because you're 103 miles from the South Pole. You've spent all this effort and time. Would you continue on, hoping that you can eke out the supplies, knowing you probably can't, that you'll die on the way back? Or do you turn around? And Shackleton saw another way, another alternative. So he said, well, what we're going to do is going to leave our tents and sleeping bags behind. We're going to walk south as far as we can for one day. We'll plant the flag, the British flag, and then we'll turn around and go back to the camp. And the next day we'll head back home. And the question becomes, why did he do this? And it was because he wanted to cross the 100-mile mark. He wanted to go back to Britain saying, yes, we didn't get to the South Pole, but we got within 100 miles, which sounded like a whole lot better than getting 103 miles to the South Pole. So they got to 97 miles to the South Pole. And there's this wonderful photograph of him. One man is taking the photograph, Shackleton and two other men, and they're standing there, and the flag's planted in the snow. And for me, that is a great lesson. I was working for a large software company thinking I want to get to a certain position in the company, realizing I'm never going to get there. And thought, it's, what am I going to do now? Was just plant my flag and go start another endeavor. And that's when I started writing, saying I want to be an author. I want to write books about decision-making in Antarctica. And it was the start of saying, I'm going to plant my flag. Okay, that's as far as I'm going to get in this corporation. And now I'm going to go off and do something that really thrills me. And it's, and so I think that's a great lesson for a lot. I think everyone can take away, just be like, life may not be the same as it was in 2019. You got to plant your flag and go, okay, now what am I going to do? And maybe it'll be something different but what's, go pursue your passion and go off and do it.
It's a really nice way to pull it all together. And I think too often people might sit on things, and there's a beautiful book written by an Australian nurse about interviews with people in there. She was an end-of-life care nurse and talked to a lot of people and said ultimately the happiest people she ever worked with in her professional career. I think she did it for 20 or 30 years and then put it all together as a book, and actually talked about how it was people who got to a point in their life, wherever it was, and actually went, no, I'm going to do this, instead of talking about it, or instead of dreaming about it, or letting their dreams fade off into the horizon, just said no, and they plant the flag and then crack on with something. So that's a really nice way to pull it all together. Brad, thank you so much again for your time. It's been really cool exploring the two books over the two conversations we've had. We'll make sure all the links to everything you're doing is in the show notes, and hopefully everyone will be able to get the books in time for Christmas.
Well, that'd be great. Well, thanks very much. It was a pleasure meeting you in person, Kevin, and being on your show. And thank you for the great opportunity.
Another great conversation there with Brad. Thank you so much again for joining us. It really is incredible what those adventurers did so long ago, but their decisions, that's what is so fascinating. They didn't have a blueprint to follow because no one had ever done what they'd done before. All the links to Brad's socials, his book and his website that explores the subject in much greater depth are in the show notes. We're now 2 shows into season 8 and we've got plenty more episodes to come. Our next conversation is with a triple Olympic diver, exploring decisions ranging from when it's throwing yourself off a 10-metre board through to how do you manage that transition into a post-athlete career. Be sure to join us for that. Just a quick thank you to both Luke Sugden and Carter Richardson for their support with producing the podcast. And as I mentioned at the start, please make sure you check out our social medias, as we've got some great content that those guys have been creating. We hope you enjoyed this week's conversation, and make sure you join us again soon for another episode of the Rogue Monkey Podcast.